Welcome to part 2 of the East Bay Leadership Series. My name is Ken Mintz, and I am the 2021 Board Chair of the East Bay Leadership Council. I am excited to help celebrate Women's History Month with today's timely conversation, focused on what employers can do to create equitable workplaces for women. As we get started, I want to take a moment to ensure everyone joining us today has downloaded the event program. If not, you can scan the QR code on the screen or follow the link in the chat. That's where you will find more details about our keynote speaker, upcoming events, and messages from our sponsors. The East Bay Leadership Council is particularly grateful for the 17 employers and 12 individuals who sponsored this year's virtual speaker series. You will see their logos and names on the screen and in the program. The EBLC's more than 8 decades of advocacy has only been possible because of employers and community leaders with a belief in and commitment to creating a vibrant economy and world-class quality of life in the East Bay. Your investment makes a profound difference. I'd also like to thank all of the elected officials and public sector leaders in attendance today. Your leadership is appreciated, and we look forward to working with you to ensure an equitable economic recovery as our community heals from the past year. Finally, I want to thank the East Bay Leadership Council's powerhouse President and CEO, Kristen Connolly. Kristen's leadership, facilitation, public policy knowledge, and vision for the organization has been at the center of our success in the past year. Thank you, Kristen, and the rest of our staff. And with that, it is time to hand it off to Kristen Connolly to continue today's program. Take it away, Kristen.
Thanks, Ken. That was such a nice little surprise. I didn't know that was in your script and really appreciate it. So obviously, I feel very supported in my role and my work here, and I'm very excited about today's conversation. So it's my good fortune to introduce our speaker today. And so we are so fortunate to be joined by Alexis Krivkovich. And I didn't actually ask Alexis if I screwed up how she pronounces her name, so she can set me straight in a moment. Alexis is the managing partner of McKinsey & Company's San Francisco office, with experience advising senior executives and helping drive change for financial services and technology companies. She is passionate about leadership development and launched an annual study to help identify gaps in female leadership with actionable steps for creating gender equity at work. The study we're about to talk about today that she's going to present about. So I could go on and on about her accolades and her accomplishments, but I will actually just take this moment to ask that you all welcome Alexis to our virtual stage. And I'm looking forward to the conversation. So please welcome Alexis.
Wonderful. It's so great to be with all of you today. So thanks very much for including me. I love that you're having this conversation. It's certainly one that I have tremendous passion around. What I thought I would do is spend just a few minutes at the front end sharing a bit of the data, because the real impetus for undertaking this effort, certainly for me and my colleagues at McKinsey really 7 years ago, was a frustration that we were taking such a critically important business topic around talent and the strategy of winning the war for talent. And we were discussing it without the fact base and the root cause analysis that we apply, frankly, to virtually every other tough business challenge that we aim to solve. And so that was really our aspiration with this work, was to use more data, more granular understanding of what's going on to help accelerate progress and get to the impact that I think many of us thought when we entered the workforce, whether that was 10 years ago, 20 years ago, 30 years ago, we were on a much faster path to see. So with that, let me kick it off. I'm going to share my screen, and I will try to not overwhelm you with all the data, although I easily could, but talk to you about the research that's here in just a few slides, and then we'll shift to a conversation. And I know I always welcome a vibrant Q&A. So what I'm going to be sharing with you is data from last year's report, the 2020 report, which came out in October. It was the 6th year we've done this study. It's a collaboration between McKinsey & Company and leanin.org. In 2020, we had 317 companies participate. And I'll tell you, that for me felt remarkable, given we send the note inquiring about participation the first week in March. And there were a few other things that happened the first week of March last year, unfortunately. And so it was remarkable so many companies we're actually still very much interested and committed in participating even through a period of such disruption. These companies represent every industry sector across the United States, and we have some participants from Canada as well, and they cover over 12 million employees. So it's a very representative and large sample size. It really is focused on corporate America. So what you'll see here is data that's focused on entry positions that have the potential to ladder over time into all the way up to executive ranks. What it does not cover is another important part of the story that's been unfolding, which is around wage workers, low-income workers, contract workers who've been disproportionately impacted by the pandemic. And we can certainly talk about that somewhat, but you won't see that represented in this data. We survey each year tens of thousands of employees about their individual experience, men and women. And it really is what underpins an understanding of not just what's the snapshot of how talent is moving, but what's actually the experience that's being had in the workplace environment. So with that, let me jump into the starting point. So here's the data pre-COVID impact of how we entered into this moment last year. And what you see here across this picture of the aggregate pipeline, so this is the view of all kind of talent flows across those industry sectors, and each sector has some differences we can certainly talk about. But we were approaching parity for women in entry-level positions. And this is important because women have made up more of college graduates each of the last 30 years in the United States. So we certainly have the talent pool to draw from. And we've been working our way closer to that representation. And similarly on women of color as well. But what you see is that it is a slippery slope at each step. And by the time we get to the C-suite, we're down to 1 in 5 representation. And if you are a woman of color, you are virtually not represented at all. And this is the real challenge for companies, is that this picture has looked quite consistent and been persistently this way for quite some time. And you can see on the bottom, there has been improvement, but I don't think relative to many expectations, we've seen nearly the acceleration of that improvement that we would have wanted. And in fact, the biggest gains have been at the top. That's great. Those are really visible positions. They have a lot of empowerment to hopefully change the dynamic inside organizations more quickly. But they're also the places we were the furthest behind. So in some cases, we were just sort of catching up to maybe a ground zero as opposed to really accelerating forward. And you'll also see that those gains have been disproportionately gains for white women, not women of color. And this is an underlying theme throughout, which is wherever we tend to make progress, we tend to make the most progress for the group that's most like the majority. And in the US and the Canadian context, that's the white male experience. And that's not to suggest every white male is having the same experience, but we consistently see in the data that as you add any layer of difference and intersectionality, both your experience, the headwinds you face, and just structurally your opportunity becomes more and more challenging. So this was coming into COVID. The reason this was so important is because every past historical downturn or market disconnect we've had, we've disproportionately lost ground for women and for individuals of color. And what we find is their ability to get a foothold and get back into the environment is that much harder. And so we were really concerned and wondering what this environment of COVID, certainly something we never expected, absolutely humanitarian tragedy on a truly global scale, what it would do to the workplace environment. And I'd say it's put us at a crossroads. And the reason I say a crossroads is because there is a case longer term for optimism. And that case is really built around flexibility. Vast majority of companies, while no one would have chosen this as the way to go into an experiment like this, feel like we've actually done something profound in the ability to open up flexible work. And they don't envision we will snap back to where we were before. In fact, most companies, and certainly every executive I speak to, is envisioning a new normal that looks somewhere in between where we've been and where we are right now. And the reason that's so important is because the number one thing women would cite historically that would help them stay more in the game would be greater flexibility in the workplace environment, greater flexibility in how jobs are constructed, how the workday is imagined, expectations for face time, et cetera. But it's truly a crossroads because we have a bright red blinking light of concern. And that is because this isn't an experiment we all chose together. We've been forced into this moment because of a global pandemic. That pandemic with COVID-19 has brought a tremendous number of externalities. And those externalities, whether we like it or not, have disproportionately fallen on the shoulders of women. And what it's resulted in is 1 in 4 women today, 1 in 4 is thinking about stepping back or stepping out of the workforce environment in this moment because of these externalities. That's over 2 million women. We would not only unwind all that progress you saw in the pipeline, we would go backwards in time by nearly a decade. So what's underneath that? What we really see when we dig into the data in a very granular level is while everybody is having a hard experience right now, absolutely, it's disproportionately challenging for women. And there are 3 groups of women that we see, and you can see here on the slide, are having experiences that are profoundly worse. The first is mothers overall, and mothers of young children, even compared directly to fathers in the same situation. And we'll talk about a little bit those reasons why. The second is senior executive women. Senior executive women disproportionately have overlaps with other roles and experiences that make the workplace more challenging to begin with. On top of that, in the context of COVID, they're being asked to play roles disproportionately in many organizations to support. And then the third is women of color overall, but especially Black women in this moment for a variety of reasons. So let me just spend a minute on each of these, and I know we're going to get into this in the Q&A. The big headline for mothers is before the pandemic, they already did a double shift, meaning we could measurably see they had more of the household responsibilities, irrespective of their earning power. And in the current moment of COVID, all of that has just gone up for everyone, but it's disproportionately gone up for mothers and mothers of young children as childcare has fallen away. A lot of times they have elder care, compounding that as school has evaporated on many people. And the result is what we think of as the double shift. They're effectively, a majority of mothers of young children are describing doing an extra 3 hours a day of household work in this moment. I mean, that's another half-time job, right? So that's an extraordinary challenge. For senior executive women, it's different. It's a combination of they overlap with being mothers. They're far more likely to be in dual career households. And so managing the complexity of this environment, they don't have the backstop that in many cases their male peers do. But they also are very likely to experience being onlys. And we can talk more about this phenomenon, but it's effectively having to represent as the only of your kind in meetings, in the workplace environment. And that comes with a lot of friction and much higher levels of microaggressions in the workplace. And for Black women, you have the combination of entering this experience already structurally the most disadvantaged in the workplace. On top of that, the pandemic is disproportionately impacting their communities. In fact, they're far more likely to be experiencing bereavement and the grieving of the death of a loved one during COVID. But also we have this heightened conversation on racial justice that really sparked in 2020. And while that's ultimately a very positive thing, the implication of that is for many Black women in corporate America today, they're being asked disproportionately to sort of represent and carry that for their organization, that conversation, that shared awakening in ways that they describe as frankly important, but really exhausting. When we think about what it means across organizations to activate, a huge piece of this is, in fact, allyship, meaning we need everybody to be thinking about this question from a strategic and talent standpoint, not just individuals who have the experiences that are more challenged. And the good news story is nearly 2/3 of employees, both men and women, self-identify as allies, in particular allies to women of color who face the most disadvantage. That's a great thing. That's a tremendous amount of intent in the organization. The challenge is we really haven't built the skills to activate that intent and turn it into action. In fact, when we ask the questions underneath, that would be some of the most powerful ways we see to activate allyship and turn it into actions that actually impact and accelerate equity in the workplace, we see much lower levels of participation and engagement. It's great you think you're an ally. Do you mentor or sponsor at least one woman of color? Only 1 in 10. Well, do you take a public stand to talk about and support racial equity so you don't leave that entirely to those underrepresented groups to have to do that on their behalf? Only 30%. Do you listen to the stories of others so you build more of a shared understanding so that you understand other experiences, not just your own, and can have more empathy and create more tactical support? Only 40%. So we have a lot of work to do to take that latent desire and turn it now into the action that makes a difference in the workplace. And the exciting thing is when we see it happening, you can see the measurable difference for individuals who describe having allies from those who do not, who are in minority groups. It's an unbelievable difference in the experience they're having in the workplace environment. So this is one of the most powerful levers, frankly, that we can activate, because you can do it at every level and every individual in every organization. So let's spend a moment on the solution space, and we'll get into this in the discussion, so I won't belabor it here. But there are a number of steps that we see companies needing to take. What I'd say is we're in a mode of true experimentation, meaning, my hope is one of the positives here, if we can have one coming out of this tragedy, is the fact that companies are feeling the need and under tremendous pressure, because they see themselves the warning signs, to really think more boldly in this moment. And I think many of those innovations will stick with us for the long term. If you take these first two together, we really do have to solve how to make this sustainable. We traded the commute, but we now sleep at the office because we work from home. And we really need to solve for that for people for the long term. And you see a huge amount of burnout happening as a result of us not having really solved for that. We have to understand performance reviews in this moment. If we don't have the same experiences outside the workplace, are we really going to expect to evaluate the same experiences inside the workplace? If we don't have the structure and support that people need, if doing everything virtually is not the same as doing it in person, how are we actually managing that and evaluating how we're thinking about applying that lens in this context? Bias doesn't go away just because we all got on a virtual Zoom together. In fact, it shows up in different ways. It's really important to think about how bias presents in this moment, in particular things that might happen disproportionately in a virtual context, and solve for those. And then I'll put those last two together, which is a huge amount of experimentation and need around support, frankly, to better recognize that a highly productive employee is an individual who's fully supported both in their work life and their non-work life. And so for a lot of companies, this has included huge investments in mental health resources and engagement, a lot of work around structural care and support outside the workplace, particularly in this moment of disconnect, better often on-ramps and flexibility programs, and then really over-communicating that. And then finally, I think if 2020 did anything, it was really shining a light on the fact that there is not one playbook that will work for all communities of talent. And in fact, we have to have the honest conversation about, for Black talent, how is that experience today? How truly broken is that experience today? And how are we going to take an intersectional lens to the work we're doing to really solve for that at a much more micro level than hoping that, the rising tide will lift all boats. So with that, if you want to read more, there's certainly more. womenintheworkplace.com has all of our research, both from the 2020 report, as well as the past 5 years preceding that. But with that, maybe I'll turn it over to the conversation, Kristen, with you.
Oh, excellent, Alexis. I was tracking some of the issues and certainly want to dive into a lot. I mean, it's really, really rich, interesting data, and there's so much to build on. So one of the things that you mentioned, right, and I talk about this a lot, about sleeping at the office, right, and this feeling of overwhelm, and setting barriers. But I did want to build on the fact you touch in the report about how the workplace has always been more unequal for Black women. And so could you take a minute and talk about how, kind of what you've, learned in that space, because this is 7 years running and that you've seen that. So can you share a little bit more about that?
Yeah, absolutely. So there are a number of things we see that make the Black experience overall, but particularly for Black women, more challenging. One of them is just structurally, we see tremendous inequity in opportunity, and that starts very early. So paint one example, that pipeline, while the biggest imbalances appear at the top, the actual biggest differences in equity of opportunity and promotion start at the very beginning. And in fact, the first promotion into manager, which really sets up a career path to executive level, is the most unequal between men and women. And this really shocked me because there's so much attention put at the top, and it's like, where are all the women? They're missing. Some sectors like tech, they feel virtually not existent. But in fact, what sets that up is a first promotion where women fall behind and don't regain that ground. And for Black women, that's even more profound. So in any company, regardless of your starting point of talent pool at the outset, for every 100 men who leaps forward into a first manager position, only 85 women do. But if you're a Latina woman, that's 71. And if you're a Black woman, it's 56. You have half the shot of getting to that first promotion, which means it takes you longer. You may never get there. And ultimately, when you do, you tend to then have a crest in your career that stops much sooner. And that has implications for pay equity and all sorts of other factors. But in addition to that, Black women are disproportionately likely to experience being onlys. And I was talking about this. Nearly half of them do on a regular basis. And that not only comes with more scrutiny, but it comes with measurable microaggressions. These are what I think of as unintentional, but really challenging headwinds that over time can sort of exhaust and stall out, frankly, a career. It's things like constantly being asked to credential yourself, being challenged on your level of expertise, being talked over and interrupted, ignored and overlooked, being asked to do more menial jobs and responsibilities than others like you. This happens very consistently. And what it leads to is individuals then feeling like they need to exit and opt out and go kind of create their own space. So for Black women, these factors, it's not one thing. And it's why one single playbook for all hasn't frankly been working, because the combination of those first two factors, and then the third one, which is far less sponsorship and support in their organizations, leads them to be in a position with the greatest headwinds and frankly, the least amount of support to break through.
Let's build on that for a second and talk about what good sponsorship looks like and how that, because in thinking about these strategies about, yes, 2/3 of folks want to say that there's allyship, and you talked about how there's real opportunity there, because when you drill down, we've got to do some skill building. So what would you say about how to build successful sponsorship, and what does that look like?
Yeah, well, I think the first thing in a lot of organizations is to actually define it. So people know what we're talking about, know when we're doing it and know when we're not. And then you can build the skills behind it. But we have a tendency to conflate sponsorship with mentorship, with broader allyship, which can be one of those or just be its own thing, with community. And in a lot of companies, like those are mushed into one thing, and then we don't really get any of those particularly well. So when I think about sponsorship, I think about something finite, meaning you can only do that well when you're doing that for a small number of people. When people tell me, oh, I'm sponsoring 40 people, I think, no, you're not. You're probably giving out free advice, right? Sponsorship means a prolonged commitment to someone to build an understanding about their path, their objectives, and using your position of power, influence, and understanding to help them proceed. It can take a lot of different forms. It could be someone in your company, someone outside. It could they don't always do the same thing for you. In some cases, they're a truth teller. In other cases, they're an opportunity creator. But it is finite because you're making a commitment to use your empowered position and your access to help someone else. Mentorship is different. Mentorship, in my mind, is somewhat infinite. It's about the hours of the day you have to have coffee chats and helpful conversations. Done well, it's more tailored than that. But really, it's about giving people advice and support, but without really the commitment to be the agent of change on their behalf, right? And then allyship could be sponsorship or mentorship, but it could also just be building your own awareness to be a champion for people who aren't like you. And community, which a lot of companies over-index on, I'd say relative to the other three, is bringing together people who don't see a lot of themselves in their organization so they can feel a sense of connection. So that's often ERG groups, employee resource groups, and other forms. That's super important too, because a lot of times people say, I don't work with any women. I don't work with anyone of my race. I don't have, so having an environment, but those are totally different things. And so in most organizations, honestly, it starts with defining it. And then the best step when it comes to sponsorship in particular is we got to get out of this mode of thinking it all has to be like a love match, where you're just going to find each other and you'll discover you're meant to support one, right? The challenge with that is what we see is it disproportionately leaves men supporting men and women supporting women. Those of the same race supporting each other. And you look at that pipeline and you say, okay, certain communities are just going to lose out. And so in great organizations, you actually think about engineering that and structuring it in a way where you get the right coverage for everyone.
Well, in thinking about engineering, right, and what you're looking for, another one of the strategies that your research talks about is building empathy in the workplace as just something that would help everyone. And you also talk about how businesses that have women in leadership and women promoted, they have better bottom line, right? So this is good business and good practice. So talk a little bit about why empathy is important. And, all of us can imagine that particularly in this moment, that empathy is very important.
Yeah, I think one of the biggest realizations in the context of COVID is how different people's individual experiences are. And so, I mean, one of the most challenging things is when we describe diversity and inclusion as sort of a zero-sum game. For someone to win over here, somebody else must therefore lose out. And I think that's such a false and dangerous paradigm to be in, because what we see, just as you said, in business impact, is that companies that have disproportionate representation by gender at the top, both executive level and in their boards, outperform consistently financially by 25%. And when you have disproportionate representation by race, that connection is 35%. You can tell I'm being Zoom bombed by my children. We'll get to that. That's a whole nother experience. Yeah. But 35%. So this is huge bottom line impact, right? But we don't manage it systematically in most companies with that mindset. Like, wow, I could outperform on EBITDA with that. And you know, that empathy is a huge piece of that, because what we have to recognize is, you know, you look back 50, 75 years ago, very few people of color in any leadership in the executive ranks, very few women. So most of these roles were defined in a time and in a context of what leadership looks like that was much narrower than the talent pools we now have available. And if we don't reset the expectation and we don't start to acknowledge that certain aspects of leadership that I'd argue 50 years ago, you probably couldn't even find a company handbook that cited empathy as an important leadership characteristic. If we don't start actually rewarding that and acknowledging that, we won't get the diversity of leaders we need to get to that performance outcome. And I think that's been a big realization, because people are recognizing, wow, what it takes to show up, particularly in a moment of crisis like COVID, is actually not 10 leaders who look like the same person leading in the same way, but 10 diverse leaders. And by the way, you know, gender, spin, you know, those are just a few ways people show up as diverse. There's diverse experiences socioeconomically, there's disability, sexual orientation, right? But if we can harness more of that, then in these moments, particularly of crisis, but even for the long term, we will get that performance bump on the back end.
Well, and you mentioned that these are sort of some universal experiences across sector, although there are some exceptions. There are some particularly stubborn sectors. And we both have experience working in them, right? I'm a former lawyer, big New York law firm, right? And for decades, women have been more than 50% of law school graduates. And yet the number remains stubbornly in the teens for the number of equity partners at law firms. And, you know, you're in consulting, very high, you know, successful, you know, and right, kind of similar stuff. And you can tell that story. I haven't worked in that world. I mean, I'm thrilled that like the East Bay Leadership Council has, you know, 2 law firms that have women managing partners. So shout out to, you know, Miller Starr and to Hanson Bridget. And I think we have, you know, at least one of those managing partners on this call right now. But talk a little bit about these stubborn sectors and kind of where we, you know, because you talked about the pipeline in the beginning and that, you know, progress has been really slow, you know, so say more about that.
Yeah, no, absolutely. I mean, the first year we did this report, I said, well, gosh, it doesn't look like we're on pace here to make a lot of change. Why don't, you know, I asked the team, why don't you build a model, like a little napkin math, and figure out how long is it going to take to get equity in the C-suite or executive ranks, just based on what we're seeing right now. And this was, you know, 5-6 years ago. And I remember I was, you know, traveling for a client. I was in Chicago and the team called me and they said, okay, it's 100 years. And I thought, no, it can't be 100. That's like my children's, you know, I didn't even count that far, you know, 100 years, what's going to be going on. And I said, that can't be right. Add more assumptions, build a better model. We're consultants. Like we do this all day long. And they came back and they were calling me. They're like, it's 250 years. It's 375. It's 506. And I was like, okay, stop, go back to the napkin math. But that was our headline the first year, 100 years, 100 years. And I'd argue at the time that was even probably optimistic. And so the situation though, like to your point, like the aggregate and the average hides a lot of sins in companies and a lot of individual situations and issues that need to be solved. So let's take 2 pretty different environments. In tech, we actually have a problem that starts what I'd call left of the pipeline, meaning we've gotten to a point now where we're not even attracting in the talent to the mainstream tech opportunities in the core of engineering and product that we would want and need to hold that representation. So if you only start at an intake pipe, like I was showing that pipeline of like 35%, it is no surprise by the time you get to the C-suite that you're at 15% or lower. And in fact, when you look at that composition over time, what starts to happen if you peel back the onion there
Mhm.
is that what diversity you are maintaining, especially on women, and in particular for Latinx and Black, a little bit less so for Asian. But what you start to see is that diversity starts concentrating in what I call like the outer ring of support, really critical roles in HR, in legal, strategy, marketing, far less in like the engine room of engineering and product and P&L, right? And so in tech, actually, a whole piece of it now is not only winning and saving every one of those individuals, but there's a lot of like culture that has to shift to get people to feel like they're even welcome and they have an opportunity to succeed in these environments. And we got to do a lot more to get women, frankly, excited about these roles after decades of looking at them and thinking, it's a bro shop and I'm not going to have the same shot. And even if I do, I'm not going to enjoy it.
Right.
You take a totally different sector, like you were talking about law firms or professional services,
Yeah.
A lot of other environments, you actually start at 50-50 or close to 50-50. But what tends to happen is the nature of the roles as you become more senior, both become very network focused. Like, are you on the deal team? Are you on the right project assignments? Like, are you landing the big fish? Which means a lot more apprenticeship matters, and how evaluation gets lined up a lot more tightly to that. And also in constructs where the historical expectations of showing up, like literally physically FaceTime, were extremely high when you had at the same time coinciding when a lot of women were thinking about family, going through other experiences that made it particularly acute to try and do both at the same time.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm. Yes. Pregnant as a third-year law student is probably why I'm doing this, Alexis, rather than an equity partner at my firm. So in terms of, so there's a lot to follow up on there. I did actually want to go to some of the questions that were submitted in advance. And so thank you to those of you who submitted questions in advance for this event. So you did mention about women on public boards. So this is a question about that. So California has a new law, as you know, requiring all boards, public boards, to have at least one woman, and which is a start, but only 16% of board members are women. So what do you think it's going to take to sort of knock down that and not have sort of the onlys, or in this question, sort of being seen as token, which is in and of itself pretty frustrating?
Yeah, I mean, I think absolutely it's a great question, because we have to get back past the like, I've got one, I've checked that box now. In fact, our own research shows you need more like 30% representation of a group to have the voice truly permeate completely, because otherwise you end up with that only scenario. I'm the one woman on the board. I'm the one Latino or Latina trying to represent every time I speak, not only my own views, but the entirety of a community that's so much larger than me. So I think that's absolutely spot on. Part of the challenge here, and this is true inside organizations as well, it's just more obvious when you look at boards, is we've historically spec'd that role to be something that automatically eliminates the vast majority of qualified people. So in public company, big boards, one of the most common things is, well, I'd love somebody with previous CEO experience, ideally in a Fortune 1000. Okay. Well, great. Well, there are more men named John who are CEOs of Fortune 1000 companies than women, full stop.
Period.
So, period. So you've already eliminated like the vast majority of possible talent. Not to mention, we're then sort of assuming when I already have 5 people who might have a profile like that a 6th person who looks like that is better than a 6th person who looks radically different, who brings something totally different to the table, right? And so I think boards are shifting on that, or at least the ones that are more, I don't know, evolved or out in front on this. But that's one of the first things we have to do, is just sort of release this idea. There's no statistical evidence that suggests that if you stack your boards only with former CEOs of public companies, you get better results. In fact, there are a lot of examples of sort of the groupthink and the blindness that comes from not having alternate perspective. And so I think that's a big piece of it, is starting to recognize we don't need 10 people who think the same. We will do better if we have 10 people who actually think quite differently, and we get that tension in the system that comes from entering a problem from different perspectives.
So then another question that we had in advance is that sort of, what does your research show, and what do you think are some effective strategies for women navigating male-dominated sectors, right? So when you're less than the 30%, what do you do? Like, what is a good strategy?
Oh my gosh, I have so many ideas. We could spend a whole hour on this.
Good.
But let me share a few thoughts. Let me collect a few thoughts. Even though you told me in advance, I was like, oh, I want to share this and this and this. Okay, so a couple of things just that scream out in the research. So the first, I talked about networks. I think early on, we often all feel most comfortable interacting with people who have shared experience, whether you're trying to offer up wisdom to someone who's earlier in their career than you, or you're looking upward for those who can give advice. And that just woefully disadvantages women, and in particular women of color, because you saw in that pipeline, there are just not enough for every senior woman. And by the way, that's one of the reasons we see so much burnout and exhaustion from senior women, is they're disproportionately holding this responsibility of a pyramid that's so much bigger at the bottom than they can manage. So you have to think proactively about expanding that lens. And you actually should think about making the ask. One of the things we see clearly in the data is that women and men ask for things in different ways. So the good news is we see women and men asking for promotion and raises, much closer to parity than we did in the past, but they don't ask in the same way. So when men ask, they are far more likely to put a dollar figure on what they think they want and what they're worth. And women are very uncomfortable doing that, and far less likely to. And they have a mindset like, you will see my value and you will therefore reward it. What we see is anybody who asks for a specific amount gets more. You may not get exactly what you asked. Your ask may be unrealistic, but you get more. And so there are things like, how do I actually make concrete what I think my value is? Make that transparent to people, show my ambition. There's a lot of discomfort in particular that women describe about showing ambition, in part because rightly they know that they are penalized for being more ambitious. So a woman who's asked for a promotion or raise is disproportionately likely to receive feedback that says they're edgy, sharp-elbowed, aggressive, etc. And men, there's no difference. You don't see any of that come through in performance data, but you still have to do it. So the first thing is get that network to be broader, because it'll set you up for the long term. The second thing is actually know what you're worth and put a value on it, and ask and agitate for it. And part of that is about doing your homework outside. Like start to think about, what would I be worth if I left here, if I'm not getting the support that I need? And then, the third piece is make sure you're getting the feedback that actually helps you grow. So what we see also is that women and men will get the same feedback on business performance described very differently to them. Managers, whether they're male or female, are more comfortable telling men hard-hitting business results related feedback. You didn't nail your numbers. If you can't get on top of that, you don't have opportunity to advance here any further than where you're at. You were not tight. There's going to be expectation on this. Women will get that same feedback couched far more in terms of communication and presentation and collaboration. Your story wasn't super tight. It was kind of hard to tell where the impact is coming together. I think you're going to need to kind of put the pieces together differently and really show you're collaborating. They're actually trying to tell you the same thing, but you could take away a totally different message on what you have to work on. And so the advice I always give is, be explicit. I want to have a role like that in the future. That's what I'm aiming for. What's a skill you think I need to develop that I don't have to get there? And how long do you think it'll take?
Oh, great. And that last piece, I think, is really important. How long do you think it will take? Because I do worry, right, that there are these extended or sort of different timelines for women than there are of men, and just different expectations about like what happens in terms of your seniority if you do take a maternity leave and all those different things. And again, I'm a little focused on the law here. The heads of my litigation group were always really comfortable just telling me how short I was on my hours. Like, you're great, you're hitting all the marks, we love you, you're terrific, just bill more hours. So which I just physically couldn't engineer. So, okay, that is really helpful. We did get another question in advance that was about, and I told Alexis that sort of I would caveat this, right? So Alexis is not a lawyer. She's not here to offer legal advice. I am a former employment lawyer specifically. And we got a question about what are options for women in the face of obvious discrimination and retaliation for reporting it. So it's important to point out, under Title VII of the Civil Rights Act, discrimination on the basis of gender is illegal. It should not happen. Retaliation is a separate, retaliation for reporting is its own. So even if you are actually not found to suffer from discrimination under underlying thing, retaliation for reporting it in and of itself is its own discrimination. And so my advice is absolutely report it to HR, use the procedures that are in your manual, and make sure that you're dealing with it. And The EEOC is the structure in the government, and sometimes it doesn't, in different parts of the country, there's uneven enforcement, but I did just want to blanket say that, you should report it. But I did want to invite, if you had, with the understanding that you are not here to offer legal advice, and this is not, your wheelhouse. I didn't know if
You certainly don't want it from me.
Well, no, but like to offer it in the data,
Yeah.
and kind of what you've seen around discrimination and disproportionate impact on women of color on that particular topic.
Yeah. No, I mean, we can see all the signs of the difference appear in a myriad of ways, many of which we've already talked about. But the most basic is, if you believe you do a good job pulling in talent, you should not have disproportionately, adverse impacts that early that you get that 100 men and 56 Black women, or the 100 men and 85 women, right? So, and that's just one of many signs that happens. A few thoughts I have around that. I certainly agree with you on the escalation path. I would say in a lot of organizations, there's a limited awareness and understanding at leadership, at the most senior leadership levels, often of what's actually going on and how different the experiences are. And I've had a lot of executives describe to me, I had no idea that was happening. And then I discovered and I realized, oh my God, that's not the company we're trying to be. And I would argue that most companies, not only because the legal liability and the reputation issues are terrible, but just frankly, because who wants to be known as the company that keeps women down, that keeps, people of color from advancing the way they should? I mean, nobody wants that. So I think there's more openness now in most organizations to want to change things if they're brought forward and they can really see, the pattern. Practically, I do think it's helpful to actually show the fact base for why. So I hear a lot from women like, I got passed over. I see myself getting passed over for opportunities I see other people less qualified getting. Part of what you need to do is have the conversation, say, here's what I have done for the company. Here are my skills. Here's what I'm capable of. Why am I not getting, and that's an opportunity I want. Describe to me the gap I need to close to get to that opportunity. And then how are you going to help me get there? Who in the organization is going to help me close that gap? And what we find is that women don't have that conversation as explicitly. And I think there's a belief like, if I do good work, I will be rewarded. And all of that bias in the system suggests that won't happen as much as it should, even with good intent. That's the first piece of it. The second one I'd say is increasingly organizations, the ones that are more forward leaning and evolved on these issues, increasingly they're saying, this is how I'm going to win the war for talent. I'm going to win the war for talent because I'm going to find all the people who don't feel like they're getting the fair shot. And I am going to be the employer of choice. Yeah. And what we see in the data is that women are more loyal to their companies over time than men are. And they do not shop around. They do not leave quickly when the opportunity is not in front of them the way their male colleagues do. They stick it out. And I think on the margin, that leads women to miss the opportunity when they do feel like they're not being fully rewarded for their excellence to go find somewhere where they will be.
Oh, that's great. So a little bit building on that, we have one of the questions in the chat for today is, can you talk about emerging HR hiring practices that are inclusive of race or that can intentionally attract women of color?
Yeah, I think one of the biggest pieces is, ensuring we're not over-speccing roles relative to actually what is demonstrated to be valued and have impact in organizations. And what I mean by that is if we have a whole legacy, which we do, of bias, lack of access, lack of networks, all sorts of things, we can end up missing out on talent simply because we're defining a role the way the person previously who held it, who's disproportionately likely to have been a white male, usually from a upper socioeconomic background with a strong educational support, right? The way that they got there. And what you miss is that if there are all these other structural barriers that are keeping other people from that access, then you miss the opportunity to bring those people in. So if you are a company that typically hires from like 10 specific engineering schools, but those engineering schools do a terrible job attracting people of color and bringing them in and getting them through successfully, you will miss a tremendous amount of talent that you should be accessing. If you go and say, no, I'm making a list of the 10 schools that do the best job in attracting diverse talent into engineering programs and graduating diverse talent, and I could care less where they sit in the ranking of whatever,
Mhm.
US magazine that is as much about, foundation size and anything else.
Mhm.
And you go seek out that talent, you will not be sitting there in a room going, I wish I could hire more, but they just don't exist. They do
Right.
exist. You just
Right.
created a set of criteria that eliminated them, right?
Mhm.
And so I think in a lot of organizations, it's actually going back very systematically at a pretty granular level and saying, where am I missing out? Are they coming and applying and I'm not getting through the application process? Because in
Mhm.
the entirety of the application process, the woman candidate met not one female,
Right.
or the candidate of color didn't meet one person who wasn't white, or is it happening even before that because I've sort of knocked them out? Or when I go to the first manager, if I overspec that role in a way where I'm basically saying white men, white men, white men, right? And I'm missing the breadth of talent. And by the way, even when we survey men, and even white men, half of them will say, I don't feel like my leadership style is fully included in this organization in
Mhm.
terms of being welcome. And I
Mhm.
feel like I have to fit a norm. So I think actually getting this right is not about trading one person's opportunity for another. It's actually about opening up everybody's opportunity.
Right. Right. And that granular analysis could really yield some really exciting, stuff, whether it's working with affinity groups to figure out, well, how could you help us get more folks just like you to, be in our ranks? I mean, I think there's lots and lots of possibilities, both in the private sector and the public sector. I wanted to just change gears a little bit because I know that you've talked about how this is really, there's 12 million employees represented in this, and you really have a corporate lens. There's a question we got in the chat about smaller organizations, and so if you could, do you think, extrapolate some of these lessons? So the question is, how can smaller organizations with just 10 or 12 people offer better leadership and advancement opportunities for women and people of color when the leadership team has a really low turnover rate? Most executives have been, like if you kind of have this loyalty and, most executives have been on the leadership team for 15 to 20 years. Any suggestions about that?
Yeah, that's really tricky, right? Because it's always ironic to me that the tech sector doesn't make faster progress because the escalation rate, like the proportion of people getting promoted in any period of time is so much higher than some other industry sectors like insurance and
Right.
other places where there's very slow movement. So your ability to change the dime, like things on the dime, is actually much, much higher.
Yeah.
It can be really hard in small organizations. There are a couple of things I would say. One is to reflect on, are we only growing talent for ourselves, or is part of our purpose to grow talent more broadly to the market? And if it's more broadly, you might at certain points want to have the honest conversation with people. You have tremendous skill, you have outgrown your role, we don't have the next role for you. You should go find that next role and let me help you find it, right? And that's really a choice, because what a lot of people do is they kind of like hoard the talent, but then they sit on them.
Right.
Women are really loyal, so they don't leave,
Yeah.
and then
Yeah.
they get they get stuck. The second thing is, most executive teams have more strategic projects or initiatives they're trying to get done than they have capacity to do them themselves. And so rethinking what it means to create opportunity to not only be about job title and advancement, but to actually be about opportunity, strategic opportunity. And so thinking about, even a local, is there something I could give to someone who I think has high potential and talent that isn't a promotion necessarily because I don't have that space for them, but gives them a chance to really stretch and to grow. So they're not just sitting here kind of playing the waiting game. I think
And
that's
feeling
another.
stuck. Yeah. Oh, that's a great perspective. Another question we have around is around what happens when there's backsliding. So we have an example from someone who actually works for a large public agency. It talks about, like, in a 3 years time, going from equal male female representation in the C-suite and on the board to 70% men. And so, like, how do you stop the wave if you see a poor trend, that it's not all everybody's marching in the direction that we want?
Yeah, this is so important. And I think a lot of companies, what I hear is how fragile they feel like their gains, even when they're making them on diversity, are. Meaning, if you don't have that many, if you only have 1 in 5 in the C-suite, I mean, gosh, someone could retire. They could get a great next opportunity you want to celebrate, to go be a CEO somewhere else. But you lose them, and you've now backtracked. You're now down to 1 in 10, right? Like, you're moving backwards. And a lot of companies experience this quite frequently. I think the important thing is to be honest about the progress we are and are not making, and ensuring we're actually feeding every level of the pipe so that you don't end up at a moment where, someone really critical who brought important diversity to the table at your leadership ranks leaves, and you haven't cultivated the talent behind them to assume those roles. And so thinking actually strategically about not only, hey, how's my snapshot looking, but am I building a base underneath it? A lot of companies are in part thinking more strategically about external hiring at leadership levels, right? And so this is what we see in the data is that women don't exit organizations at higher rates than men. We talked about them being more loyal, so it's not attrition, but external hiring in the vast majority of companies is really dilutive, meaning the people who are job hopping are less diverse. And then you start bringing in at the top a pipeline that, especially if you're out in front, looks more like somebody who's a laggard than a leader, and you actually unwind a lot of your own progress. And so I think a lot of companies, it's actually breaking that down and saying, how are we doing on that piece? And are we attracting talent equally by gender, by race, not just in entry level, but are we actually injecting it at the leadership level? And I think in organizations that are moving backwards, like you described that example, a piece of that is saying, like, how many candidates are we looking at that are diverse? Are we looking at sources, even at senior leadership, that might be groups that focused previously in diverse populations that we should be drawing from and considering as candidates, and having that honest conversation about what's happening at every level, not just like our aggregate picture.
And that kind of analysis too will yield an understanding of how many people are in the only kind of position and what your vulnerabilities are there. We had a program in the fall with chief diversity officers, and one of the chief diversity officers was from Twilio, and she talked about one reason she was willing to move across the country and change jobs was that she wasn't going to be the only, and she wasn't going to be in one of those periphery things. She was really going to be reporting to the CEO, and that they had a lead, she described it a little bit like a unicorn. They had a Black female head of engineering. And so she was, as two Black women being able to lead together was really, really powerful. And so, but I hadn't thought about sort of the dynamic of who's leaving and who's getting hired into those points externally and how that can affect things.
Well, and we have to recognize that everyone's perception is not the same. We've actually trained ourselves on the idea that it's normal to have a room that's mostly made up of men. It's normal to have a room that's mostly made up of white leaders, right? And so we don't even see it half the time. I mean, I see it because I'm constantly like 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6. Okay, divided by. I'm doing that all the time in my head. But what we see in our data is 35% of men will say that women are well represented in senior leadership when they make up less than 1 in 10. A third of men will think we're well represented and we're hitting the mark when we have less than 1 in 10. And if you put that into context, like we have trained this in the context of not just business, but even in broader media. When you count background characters in an animated production, so this is like cartoons, where all you have to do is draw, only 17% of them are female. Background characters, like these aren't even like the protagonists. Right. And so we've meant this mental model. Like the number of times I'm in a situation where people are like, whoa, look at all the women. Like I feel that way every day. A sea of men, like, and it's even more profound by race. Like there's a lot we need to do to just actually help people see that the imbalance is actually there.
Right. Okay. Well, and you might want to wave your magic wand about changing perception based on what you just said, but I kind of warned you that this was coming. So what I would love to get from your many years of doing this and all the work that you do with companies, what would be, if you were all powerful, what would be the 1 or 2 sort of federal policy changes, if you thought that there needed to be any in this space?
Oh my gosh. I'm going to caveat that this is personal perspective.
Absolutely. Not at all on behalf of your giant global company or anything.
All right. Mandatory paid maternity leave. We cannot help women maintain footholds, particularly when they are that overlaps with more senior levels. It cannot happen if you don't feel like you can exit and have safety and protection to come back, that you don't feel like you can take the time that you need. It shocks me in this country, given how advanced we are, how far behind we are on that. I think if I could pick one more, I think we need a much more aggressive form of like the Rooney Rule. I think our boards, this idea like these people can't be found, talented people who could represent perspective that could help companies advance. We're going to have to wait 20 years because we never grew the population. That's just, I have words that I won't say out loud, but not
right.
ridiculous. They're like, which is the word that's
Okay.
not a swear?
Yeah.
Ridiculous. And I think we need to get way more aggressive, because what we do see in Europe is that when you mandate these things move very quickly, because it only takes a little bit before people go, oh my gosh, I didn't think they were out there, but they were. And I thought a little creatively. And by the way, she's fantastic.
Right.
And a breath of fresh air, right? And the idea we have that there's risk to difference, as opposed to there's risk in not having a difference.
Yeah.
Is, I think, something we need to debunk. So those are my two.
Well, I appreciate it. I know I looked like I took you a little bit out of your comfort zone there, but I knew you would have something great to say, which you did. And if it's for what it's worth, right, in the policy space, I've been quite aware that there have been way more men named John who've served in Congress than women in total. So, I mean, it's definitely, there's so much more room to move in lots of things. So I will take it also too. I did get a question about, so there was this a news story yesterday, you may have seen it. A reporter from the Chronicle had a story about the woman on the board of supervisors who warned her colleagues and said, okay, it's Women's History Month. I'm actually going to have a staff person analyze how much interrupting and sort of mansplaining happens, right? And so sort of, right, if in a committee or in the full board of supervisors, sort of the proportional number of men, like if there were 66% men, were they talking more or less than 66% of the time? And that in fact, shockingly no. And so the little secret was that when she announced it, it had already happened. The analysis had already been done. So there was no chance to game the system and have the gentleman on the board of supervisors just like behave very deferentially to their female colleagues. So it turns out they did get, and they interrupted their women colleagues more than they interrupted their male colleagues, right? So
that happens on the Supreme Court. They were showing that.
That's right. That's
very own Supreme Court that happens.
I would assume that doesn't at all surprise you, although that is not the kind of thing that you delve into in this report, but it is all part of it, right? I mean, it's a part of the microaggressions. It's about how women feel overlooked or don't feel listened to in the workplace. But that's consistent with what you've seen, right? In all of this work?
Yeah, and maybe I know we're pretty much at time. I would say, I think a simple thing everybody can do that kind of speaks to this point is it's really hard to actually always champion yourself. Mm-hmm. To sit there and be like, you're interrupting me. Can I finish my thought? Okay, I actually just made that point. That's the exact same point I just made. It is really easy to do that for someone else. You don't need to be the same gender. You don't need to be the same race. You don't even need to really know each other. So turn to someone if you feel like that's happening to you and say, could you watch for this on my behalf? Because I feel like it's happening a lot. And even if they're like, what? And they don't agree with you, suddenly people actually see something. I mean, you go into the market to buy a new car, all of a sudden you're like, oh, that's a black SUV. I like that one. Oh, what's that one? Because your brain activates to look for something. So if you turn to someone and say, I feel like this is happening to me, could you watch? What you find is not only do you not have to expend your own energy and personal capital all of the time, but you will, by definition, get other people starting to become more aware that these are issues, because very often they don't experience them. And if they don't experience them, they don't see that only 17% of the background characters are women.
Yeah. Wow. Well, you have been extraordinary. I had very high expectations for our time together. So thank you very much.
Well, wait, you didn't say if I met them or not. No, I'm just kidding. This is great. This is so much fun.
You exceeded my expectations.
Oh, okay.
Without question. And this, I knew that I would just really enjoy this conversation. So if we didn't already have everybody muted and unable to do so, I'm sure they would be making lots of noise and applauding and things like that. So yeah, we will say goodbye to Alexis. I'm going to take a couple and make a few more announcements, and then we're going to break off into table talk groups. So thank you so much, Alexis.
Thanks, everybody. Great to be with you.
So just a couple things, right? So what we have taken the feedback of our sponsors. We're grateful to our sponsors for this conversation. Your program has a couple of things about upcoming events. So on April 8th, which is 2 weeks from today, we're going to be having, as part of our Capital series, a discussion. I'll be moderating a conversation with Tim Grayson, Assembly member in Concord. about his legislative priorities. And then also then immediately 1 week following, we're going to be on April 15th having the third and final part of the 2021 East Bay Leadership Series. So we'll hope you join us for a moderated conversation between Alex Marin Sr. and Mark Gould of the Federal Reserve Bank, and talking about another take on equity initiatives and the economy and why all of that matters. So we'll hope that you'll join us for that. So, it is my pleasure to be a female leader at the helm of this great organization and working with so many women. I was a little surprised that 90% of our attendees for today were women. I was hoping that more men would join the conversation, but we have a lot of great information to share. I have so many good takeaways. Everyone should ask for a raise. Okay. My entire team is on here and I'm saying that everyone should ask for a raise. And be explicit about it. So again, we put it in the chat about going to the website, but it's womenintheworkplace.com. They will be updating the report this fall for 2021. There's a lot of great information in the report about how to move forward and how to do things, how to make a difference for folks. So what we're going to do is the next thing is that we have automatically assigned you into breakout rooms. And if you were, registered with some folks, we've kept you with those people. We know that some of you are might not be able to stay for the conversation, but we hope that you'll just spend a few minutes saying hi, spending time together, and really connecting. So with that, I'm going to go ahead and thank Ken for kicking us off in such a great way. And we're going to go ahead and send everybody off to their breakout rooms.